Well, welcome back, everybody. We hope you had a good break. Again, I'm Suze Schrant, and I will be moderating this session. First, we're going to have a quick poll question to just kick off our discussion, and you should be seeing that question on the screen now. So we'll just take a moment and let you respond. We'll give it a minute or so for the responses to come in. Okay. It's been about a minute. If we want to show the results, I'm not seeing them yet. I don't know if others are. Okay. Here we go. So a lot of diversity in the responses here in terms of the biggest challenges, maybe lack of capacity, lack of funding, but also organizational barriers and time needed to develop. And so we'll be exploring some of these answers and issues throughout the rest of the day and at the end of the day with our reactor panel. But for now, let's go into our panel discussion. And I'm excited to introduce our next panelists. First, we have Mr. Michael Thompson, who is the president and CEO of the National Alliance of Healthcare Purchaser Coalitions, which we'll refer to as the National Alliance. They are the only nonprofit purchaser-led organization with a national and regional structure dedicated to driving health and healthcare value across the country. So welcome, Mike. Thank you for being here. Next, we have Dr. Laura Lassiter, who's the Senior Director of Policy and Research at Pharma. And prior to joining Pharma, Dr. Lassiter was at Friends of Cancer Research, where she led policy related to drug and diagnostic test development and regulation, including modernized approaches for the development of cancer therapies and legislative reform of diagnostic test regulations. So welcome, Laura. Thank you for being here. And then last but not least, we have Ms. Yvette Venable, who has been closely involved with this project right from the beginning. Ms. Venable is ICER's Vice President of Patient Engagement and leads the organization's enhanced patient engagement program, ensuring that patient and consumer voices are driving ICER's processes and decisions. Yvette is an accomplished global healthcare leader with more than 20 years experience in patient advocacy, health policy, and biopharma communications. So thank you all for joining us today. Just as a quick backdrop, on July 20th, in preparation for this session, the National Health Council held a virtual listening session with members of sort of a large assortment of stakeholder types. So value assessment, health technology assessment, and industry. So representatives from across those sectors came together to discuss their views and reactions to the patient-centered core impact set and to the blueprint itself. We had 7 members on that call. And so similar to the previous panel session, I'll be sharing some of what we heard in the listening session on the 20th and asking for our panelists' reflections and insights. And so let me just start with kind of general impressions, and maybe I'll start with you, Yvette. Could you comment on what you think the strengths are of a patient-centered core impact set and strengths of the blueprint to develop them?
Absolutely. So I've been a big fan of this project since I signed up to be a part of it early on. And I really want to congratulate NHC and Eleanor and yourself, Suze, for getting it to this point, because I think it's a very exciting opportunity for all of us who have a stake in trying to improve the patient-centeredness of our health system. So certainly from an ICER perspective, we start with a grounding in trying to understand what's most important to patients. And today we currently do that by talking to patient communities, looking through voice of the patient reports, doing literature searches, those kinds of things. But I see huge potential for us to be able to work with a patient community who has a PC-CIS and know right from the beginning the prioritization of what's most important to them. And I think that will have a really key impact in us not only understanding the broader impacts of a condition beyond just the health outcomes, but things such as ability to pursue life goals, pursue education, work opportunities, even decisions about making having a family can be very important from the patient perspective. So those are the kinds of things that are important for us to look at as we're evaluating the evidence and trying to assess the value of these new treatments based on what's important to patients. But as somebody mentioned in an earlier question, sometimes these priorities can vary depending on a patient's own experience. And we find in our type of research as well, subpopulations can be a critical way for us to take different views of the evidence. So if we can work with a patient community who has a PC-CIS to identify those subpopulations, that could be a real benefit in our research as well. So tremendous opportunity here. And I think the diversity of stakeholders represented on this call today also shows how important having this information will be to so many different aspects of what we're doing to make healthcare more patient-centric. And I think the stronger we can be aligned in supporting the patient community to build these, the better off we're all going to be in the long run.
That's great. Thank you so much, Yvette. And I appreciate and echo your enthusiasm. I think we're really eager to get this out. And so we really appreciate your insights. Laura, I'm going to come to you next. So what are your thoughts on, strengths, importance of both the concept of a PC-CIS and also the blueprint itself?
Yeah, I think one thing that I would remark on with the strengths, the benefits are the transparency that are emphasized in the blueprint, in that, these efforts need to be publicly accessible, open sourced, that it provides a viewpoint into who's involved, how, and at what points in the process of developing a PC-CIS, and that it enables more alignment between data collection and the decision making in healthcare, which I think is extremely important because this helps to inform, what we like to talk about policy all the time is evidence-based medicine. The transparency of the process and into a PC-CIS is extremely important. And the other component that I think is a real strength is that it standardizes the process to creating this core impact set, to enable it to evolve with the patient experience, as Yvette was commenting on. As medicine advances, the patient experience changes, and this enables a iterative process, allows it to evolve with that.
Thank you so much for that. And I think kind of timeliness, or as in the legal world, we talk about things that are ripe for discussion. I think that's something that came out in several of the discussions. And as we were building this, that you want to make sure the data you're using is reflective of what's happening now. And so I really appreciate you honing in on that. I think that's an important point. Mike, I'm going to come to you next. What are your thoughts on sort of general strengths and importance of the PC-CIS and the blueprint?
Yeah, employers, you say, well, why are they a stakeholder here in the table? Well, it turns out that they're paying for most of the care happening in the country, right? And we talk about payers as intermediaries, but largely those costs get passed through to employers outside of Medicare and Medicaid. And so they're very anxious to understand the impact of the types of decisions that they're making or are being made on their behalf. And they clearly want to do right by their employees and their families, but they don't always know the impact of what they're doing on employees, on their families, or what their intermediaries are doing in that regard. And so I think having kind of voice of the patient is central to that, and often understood and undervalued in the processes that we have. And we know when we've had patient advocacy organizations involved in our processes, it always enriches the conversation and helps understand the nuance of the conversation at a whole another level. I think the advantage of taking an approach like this is it's not as dependent or reliant on one individual representing a group, but actually is systematically collecting information from a broad, diverse set of patients and bringing it to the fore. And then the question is, how do you then translate it into the policies and practices, what I'll say upstream, that impact their access and the equity of the system in supporting it.
Great, thank you so much. And we echo the critical importance that employers and purchasers play in this space. So we're glad you can be here to comment from that perspective. We heard during the listening session on the 20th that the blueprint is potentially important because it may help industry improve processes that they use to capture these types of patient data. So let me kind of start with you, Laura. Does that resonate with you? Does that sound like something that seems possible or feasible?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Core impact sets help give us a reference for what is important to patients. It's vitally important that we are listening to patients when developing a drug development program, so that we can ensure that that program is meeting the needs of the patients, whether that be from addressing clinical outcomes that are important, to addressing barriers and difficulties with joining a clinical trial, to improving the data collection, the quality of the data that is collected, to ensure that it is reflective of the patient population that's most likely to be utilizing the drug. So it's really important, and a core impact set can help start that conversation, be a reference to help inform those processes.
Great, thank you so much. And Yvette, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, you wear so many hats. So you've got your HTA hat, but you've also had an industry hat. So I'm curious about your perspective on this question.
Yeah, it also makes me think of the question that was asked earlier about, this seems overwhelming, particularly to an advocate who's working in rare and orphan diseases, and maybe, a team of one running her organization and all of that. And one of the things that happens in rare disease drug development is when we start to see a signal for a new science working in a certain way, we want to turn to the patient to learn as much as we can from them. And I'm saying that like with an industry hat on. And so if there's one organization run by one person, that's a big burden for that person to deliver to everybody. But it's a critically important role, of course, because we want the patient insights to drive that entire process. So with the PC-CIS, if we can invest in helping even those small groups do that, it really puts them in the driver's seat when they're engaging very early on in clinical development and having those conversations and making sure that the prioritization of what's most important to those patients comes forward. And it helps to supplement, those disease areas where we don't have a lot of patient relevant data that has been generated by the clinician community or other research communities as well. So I think, again, it's a huge opportunity to embed something very early on within our clinical trial system that will help all stakeholders throughout the entire life cycle of the development and the commercialization of those agents really work to the benefit of the patients at the end of the day. Because what we all want is for our innovative products to really address the needs of patients and not just be something that's, validating a scientific signal. We want that to be useful and helpful to the patients who are going to be using them.
Excellent. Amen. I couldn't agree more. That's great to hear. One of the things that was interesting from that listening session on the 20th is that we heard a fair amount from folks about potential challenges for their organization in using a PC-CIS. But we also heard thoughts or concerns maybe about what some challenges might be for patient groups when it comes to being able to create a PC-CIS, and Yvette, you just touched on some of these. So I've got sort of a two-part question for all of you, and Mike, maybe I'll start with you. Do you, from your perspective, see any potential challenges for patient groups when it comes to them being able to create PC-CIS? And then also from your perspective among the purchaser community and in the value space in general, do you anticipate any challenges in just the use of information from a PC-CIS, things like resistance? What are your thoughts on those two types of challenges?
Yeah, so, and I don't know that I'm the right person to comment on how difficult it will be for a patient advocacy organization to put together a PC-CIS. Again, favoring the comment earlier that the name is really a tongue twister for somebody that doesn't live it, right? So it is what it is. But I will kind of comment on the latter point, which I think is very, very relevant. You know, if you're an employer, frankly, even if you're a health plan, the amount of things that you're trying to manage and understand and deal with are enormous. And the idea that you're going to be able to read, you know, thousands of these evaluations and consider that in your decision making is just not realistic, right? Having said that, there are some great examples of advocacy organizations who have stepped out in front and engaged with the purchaser and the payer community in a very progressive and collaborative way, and have influenced policy and practices for their patient community, and probably even more broadly because they step forward. Now, and I always think of the National Hemophilia Foundation as a great example of that, where they have helped us to better understand how what we're doing is impacting patients, and with that, we've been able to advocate together on helping to improve things together. So I think part of the balance here is to figure out how to make sure that all the voices get heard. And in some parts of the industry, if you're narrowly focused on finding a disease for a disease, yes, you're going to go all in on that. But at a higher level in the industry, I think we're going to have to think more with a synthesization and a teamwork approach of where's the commonality and how do we build processes that make sure that this voice of the patient is considered systematically in those processes, because everybody who potentially influences it doesn't have the time to read every one of these things. And so that's the balancing act. And I can't understress how critical the voice of the leading advocacy organizations to step forward on behalf of their own organizations, but frankly on behalf of the broader patient populations to influence the system more broadly. So I know that's kind of an oxy, you know, those are two different factors. Yes, invest, but not everybody has to invest, and not everybody's going to get read. You've got to have enough concentration and synthesis to have the industry and the purchaser populations hear it and act on it.
No, I think that was very helpful. I think we have to think about reality in application, and we'll get to a question in a few minutes about sort of carrots and sticks. How do we sort of push this forward? But first, I want to come to you, Laura, your thoughts on this question, both from an industry perspective, and then if you have thoughts sort of about patient advocacy organizations and their work to create these, where do you see potential challenges?
I think challenges, I think this is reflective of both industry and patient organizations, is the infrastructure needed to support this, and particularly data collection. I mean, the infrastructure needed to support it is it really needs a lot of investment in, and it can be very cumbersome, onerous to collect all of this information. And so, having easier, more readily available ways to collect the data and then, store the data and then convert that into usable forms that we can use depending on the fit for purpose use. Different data is important for drug development and, FDA regulatory purposes than would be needed for, value assessments from once the drug is on the market. And so we have to be able to collect it in a way that isn't onerous for patients, and that it's usable and a high enough quality that we can use it for the purposes that it's needed for.
Such an important point, and I think one of the reasons we really wanted to stress in the blueprint that if you can reuse or repurpose existing data, please do. If we can avoid repeating steps or reinventing the wheel, that'll be a really important factor in making these really come to fruition. Yvette, I'll come to you next. Your thoughts about challenges, again, both from the HTA space, but any other thoughts about potential challenges for patient groups?
Yeah, what comes to mind with regards to the patient groups actually is sustainability too. There may, we don't want these to be one-off projects that get done, maybe have some short-term application and then get forgotten about as different changes and priorities happen within the patient organizations as well. There needs to be long-term commitment from all stakeholders to be able to support the patient communities in ensuring that these can be refreshed and updated and reprioritizations happen as hopefully the patient journey changes due to new treatments and the availability of better healthcare and access to healthcare. So that's something I think needs to also be thought about in terms of the patient group challenges. From an HTA perspective, one of the things that we struggle with even now without having PC-CIS formally systematized right now is being able to, really have the data to show how the new interventions are going to address whatever the patients have told us is most important to them. And that becomes a real frustration because the patient groups spend a lot of time and effort working with us and educating us about that. And they naturally want to see that reflected in the analysis. But time and time again, we're up against this wall where we don't have the data either through clinical trials or other sources to actually show how this new treatment is going to impact on that. And so I hope that with having information through a PC-CIS, earlier in the overall life cycle of the development of the product, we'll be able to maybe identify those areas where additional research may be needed in order to support those analyses down the future as well. And that feels like, again, oh gosh, there's even more. After you do this, there's even more. But again, it could just be like an indication or a prioritization then of where there are research gaps and a call to action for the research community to try and help fill those gaps. It doesn't all need to be on the patient community itself as well.
That's a great point. That spirit of collaboration again, that there are many roles to play, even if patients are at the helm. And I just want to pause for a minute and remind everyone that if you have questions or thoughts as we're having this discussion, please don't hesitate to use your Q&A function and we'll try to get to those. But I kind of foreshadowed a minute ago that we were going to get to a bit of a carrots and sticks question. And this is something that came out pretty vocally in our listening sessions, that while the blueprint is, we all agree exactly where the field needs to go, for this to really become common practice, we need pressure from groups like the US FDA, from the EMA, from others to really kind of help force the culture change along. And so just curious about thoughts about that. Maybe does that need resonate with you, but also what's the likelihood? How can we bring that into being? And so maybe I'll start with you, Laura. Thoughts about, FDA, EMA, other bodies that would help sort of make this a reality in the drug development space.
Yeah, so I agree that I think that there needs to be broad engagement from stakeholders in order to bring about culture change. In terms of FDA and industry, I think there's absolutely a movement on, the critical importance that patient engagement, patient experience data play in drug development. But, the question I think is not whether or not it's important and whether both stakeholders if you want to incorporate it. I think the question is more of how do you do that? Industry industry can't just go out and collect data and, say, here we go, this is data that we collected, FDA review it. Industry needs some feedback from the agencies to be able to say, to know what the agency is going to look at and how they're going to consider that data. And so it's a two-way conversation. And so more guidance is needed, information from the agencies on how they will review, how they will consider information is important, so that industry can then say, start to look at how can we collect this data? How can this be incorporated? The flip side of that coin is FDA needs to be able, in order to issue guidance, in order to say how they're going to look at this information, they need to understand it themselves. And so there's, a lot of work that needs to be done for the agency to be able to understand how it's collected, what it can be used for. And FDA is already doing a lot of this work ever since the prescription drug user fee bill was reauthorized in 2012. The formation of the patient-focused drug development program at FDA has been doing a lot of work to better engage with patients and understand patient priorities and in drug development. And this new reauthorization of the user fee bill, which will hopefully be passed very soon, it's already, includes components that have been negotiated. FDA will start to work more on for outcomes sets, and in issue guidance and collection and submission of patient experience data. So we're getting there. I don't think that it's an issue of needing a carrot or a stick. I think that the process is going, but it does unfortunately take time to do it right. And so, support, I think, is the key. Support from all stakeholders to help make this culture change through evidence generation and understanding is really the key to making it move forward.
Great, and I appreciate the hopefulness in that answer, that we are on the right track, we're getting there. Yvette, I'm going to come to you next. What do you think about sort of helping with the momentum in the HTA community, but maybe both domestically and internationally? What can help kind of move this culture change?
Well, something that I'm working on quite actively with a group of patient stakeholders right now is, how do we make it more practical? And by practical, I mean, how do we focus these things in order to help the patient communities understand what exactly is going to be most relevant when they come before an HTA, and be able to focus their efforts there, so they're not taking on, a massive project without knowing, how ultimately it's going to be used. But then also within our process, like, there are different stages where different types of patient insights become more relevant, or different types of data can be used, right? So early on in our process, it does tend to skew more heavily towards anecdotal or testimonial type information. When it gets into economic modeling, we're looking for harder measures and harder data points. As we get into the policy discussion and public deliberation, we can use a blend of both. And that's throughout all of those things, there could be a role for a PC-CIS to be used within that. So I'm really looking forward to working with the patient community in order to map out exactly how do we use these tools to best effect within our specific type of HTA process. And hopefully that can be something that other HTAs can learn from as well. There are other tools out there, such as the Global Patient Experience Navigator that PFMD, a global initiative, has been working on. And I think that's another tool that I really look to understand, how do we better all get our arms around the opportunity here and make sure we can really harness the best patient insights to make sure that our research is really reflective of what matters most to patients, and that decisions are being driven by that patient perspective.
Great. That's great. Thank you so much. Mike, I'm coming to you next, and thinking about sort of the employer and purchaser landscape, where would that sort of motivation or momentum come from? What can sort of inspire different groups and organizations to use something like a PC-CIS?
first of all, I think employers are very much focused on the value equation. What's the value of the treatment? What's the outcomes that we achieve with those treatment? And then, of course, what's the cost of that treatment? And is the incremental cost compared to other treatments worth it for the incremental value that it brings? And that's always a judgment call to some degree. I think sometimes the value of this broad assessment of patient experience is that we can broaden that numerator. What is the value? And a lot of times it's not what we traditionally think of as outcomes, because if it helps people get on their feet back to a more normal life, if it simplifies caregiving, if it helps people resume their activities at work, all of that should be weighed in equally in the context of value. Having said that, there's not unlimited amount of money. And oftentimes part of where patient advocates, I think, have stayed in their corner, but not broadened their perspective enough, in my view, is to look at the bigger picture on what we're trying to manage here, which is, affordability and value. And I think with that in mind, my sense is we should be advocating for understanding all the impacts and appreciating all the impacts when we're doing our value assessments. But at the end of the day, access, affordability, and equity are intertwined. And affordability has to be part of that equation, and not just affordability to patients, but affordability to purchasers too, because some of these price tags are getting extraordinary. And how do we keep both of these and get on the same page? And this is where I think patients and purchasers, frankly, are very well aligned. Affordability for patients, access for patients is very much what purchasers want, but a lot of times what's being offered isn't exactly that. And so we have to work on it together. And I think where it's optimized, that's where we go. I don't know that you can mandate that culture of collaboration, but honestly, as we think about how to deal with some of the affordability issues, we're starting with a mindset that we need patients to be central to that conversation and work together on where can we make things more affordable at the same time.
That's so helpful. And Mike, you're making me think of back to the value of these use cases. Once we start having examples of success stories, whether that's in the employer value space, industry, HTA, it doesn't matter. These success stories will just help really incentivize use and uptake and kind of prove the worth. I wanted to pivot for a minute and actually surface a question from the Q&A that I thought might be really interesting to pose to you all, because it's kind of a very practical nuts and bolts question. The question was about how we envision different groups, different end users accessing a PC-CIS or even knowing it exists. So when you think about that, what's a perfect scenario? How would you even know these exist, and how would you come upon them? And Mike, I'll go back to you and then come to you, Yvette and Laura.
Well, again, people aren't out there looking for them. So this is where the advocacy organizations, the patient-oriented organizations really play a key role, is promoting what's available and understanding that voice. I also think it's nice to promote the broad patient experience broadly, but synthesizing, again, what's messed up that's messing this up. Right? That's what really helpful. You live in the variation, what's not working. Let me know about it, or let others like me know about it, because, we're really on your side. We want to help you make it work. But I can't know everything about every, I think somebody said there's 10,000 diseases. I'm not a doctor, right? I can't know all that and won't know that at the end of the day. So helping me understand that is important. And frankly, advocating in that space where that's done, and where it's done with a balanced lens of I understand what's happening on your end here. How do we work together to try to figure it out so that we don't put patients in the middle and we allow them to get access to what they need to improve their lives? That's where we want to be, but we want to do it thoughtfully and prudently and with that broader lens.
Thank you for that. Laura, I'm coming to you next on this question about where would it be most valuable when we think about industry just being aware that a PC-CIS is available. What's the best pathway look like for that kind of availability and accessibility?
Yeah, I'm going to echo, I think, what Michael just said, and we're harking back to something that Len was talking about earlier, and that patient groups are, and the power is in patient groups is them as a convener. And so I think that where the patient group being involved in the formation of the core impact set is important because of the convening power and ensuring that all stakeholders are at the table. Similarly, I think that's how we're going to become aware of these things as well, as the patient groups and their ability to have connections to all of the various stakeholders to push the existence of the importance of the core impact sets out there.
And Yvette, what are your thoughts on sort of how would ICER be connected or know these exist? What does that look like?
Well, what I'd like to say is there were several people on the first poll who saw the potential of using this within HTA and value assessment. So my open invitation is for anyone who's thinking of developing this, who knows that they have a pretty robust pipeline with the potential for ICER to maybe be looking at those new agents sometime in the next few years. Please, let's get in touch and have a conversation now, because I think there's a really great opportunity to map out, how this works within HTA and to use it as a way to kind of document a use case for others to then be able to benefit from that experience and learn from it and understand how to improve things as we move forward. So, we're all starting from a pretty initial place right now. So there's a lot of opportunity to work together to figure out what is the practical roadmap for implementing these, and how do we do it together so that it can be most useful to users such as an HTA organization, for example.
And Susan, if I could just pile on, it's hugely valuable to purchasers and the employer community more broadly to have entities like ICER and other HTAs incorporate these into their processes. In other words, we can't look at everything. We can't know that, but we do rely heavily on intermediaries that should be working for us because we're paying the bill, right? And they, at the end of the day, I think we can insist that they do, and we should insist that they do. But secondly, I think they play a very important and valued role. And again, they can always get better in those processes. And that's about building it into the system, if you will, so that the system works better for all of us.
That's great. Thank you so much for those thoughts. The last question we have is kind of a two-part. And that's, we all have talked about how much the blueprint emphasizes leadership from the patient community in the PC-CIS development. That's sort of a hallmark. And so the question is, what are your thoughts on how that patient leadership enhances the blueprint, but also how it can pose challenges? I think we've heard a lot from all three of you about the myriad benefits of that patient leadership. Curious if anyone has thoughts on any potential challenges, roadblocks that, having something patient-led could pose. And I'll just kind of open that up to anyone who has a thought.
So I have given a couple of good examples, or at least one good example, where National Foundation for Hemophilia has really shown leadership in the patient advocacy space, but honestly influenced the entire industry to take a different lens on some of these things. Some of the other experience that sometimes in our world isn't as positive is when it kind of comes across as I just want everything for nothing. Right. And I think that is I think this is where understanding each other's perspectives as we come forward is building a relationship that builds trust and helps to lean into sustainable solutions and sustainable collaboration. And again, if it just kind of comes across as not that, I think that's a loss. So I think some of it is a learning experience to learn multiple perspectives on why things operate the way they do, and then engaging in that type of mindset together and make sure we're totally conscious on the patient perspective on the other side. I don't know if that's helpful, but I share that not because I've had that experience, but I've heard it from others. And I think that, honestly, I think that doesn't help. What we need to do is get on each other, understand each other's perspectives better and then work together.
And I think it does help. And I think part of what's baked into suggestions for various methodologies in the blueprint really speaks to this, to understanding diverse perspectives in the room. Even the prioritization processes for creating the PC-CIS are really grounded in that idea that we need to respect and learn from one another in these processes. So I think that's helpful. Laura or Yvette, other thoughts on this question, on any potential challenges by having something be patient-led in a
Yeah, I'll say one, which I don't necessarily, it's not my personal belief, and I'm sure it's not the belief of anybody on this call today, but we know that there are certain people out there who would say that, data coming from patient communities is not, as reliable or robust or as, quality evidence as those coming from more clinical researchers. Now, we may all know that's not true, but certainly there's a broader perception that that could be an issue. And I think it's difficult sometimes when you're a leader in the patient community, always championing that, like you can get worn down by that. And again, it kind of leads to that sustainability issue. So I just think that's maybe something we need to recognize. And again, as all stakeholders with an vested interest in the success of this project and the need for our patient stakeholders to be able to have the ability to generate quality data, we have a real role to play in carrying that flag and making sure that everybody recognizes that data generated by the patient community is as robust, as solid, as quality as data coming from any academic or other institution that may be out there.
That's so important, Yvette. Thank you for raising that. And I think, Laura, you mentioned maybe in your initial comments something about transparency. And I think, again, that the goal of some of what is baked into the blueprint is that not only are the methods used rigorous and the data collection rigorous and robust, but then it's all transparently reported and shared. So there's really no question about the quality of the data or how it was collected or analyzed, because we want to be really upfront and out loud about those things. Laura, any other thoughts on this question?
I think my thoughts are sort of building off of what already was said, and I'll just continue on the line of talking about the data. And I mean, we've already heard today about patient groups being resource strapped. There's maybe a few people, they don't have the staffing to really, I mean, this is a large undertaking. And the concern then being is this shouldn't be just a one and done, but these sorts of efforts there needs to be continuity, the continuing to collect data, continuing to expand on the efforts. And so I think getting to some of the quality of the data is making the data collected in a way that is sustainable. Pharma has been working with the Genetic Alliance to explore other ways of collecting data, whether that's crowdsourcing or digital technology-enabled data collection. Developing those methodologies so that data is more easily collected, it's less onerous on the patient group and the patients, can really help to improve the quality of the data and the trust in it. So I think that's a key thing that can solve some of those issues that we see if it is a primarily patient group driven process, and conserve that patient centeredness of the process, which is really the vital component of it.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. We can all agree the patient leadership is a vital component. Thank you all so much for your time and your insights. This was such an enriching discussion, so thank you.